to the future of food. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Mlakabi people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather here today, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name's Franca. I'm one of the owners of the cannery, and I'm just really excited to be kicking off this new event series today. Because it's something we've talked about for a really long time. We actually, before we even opened the restaurant in 2019, we had already talked about what we want the cannery to be. And one of the things we said was we'd like the cannery to develop into a space for the community to get together and to have conversations and to share ideas and to look at the issues we're facing, especially regarding food production and agriculture. So this is really means a lot to me to be here today, so thanks for coming. And it's my first time as an MC, so please forgive me if I'm already struggling with the microphone. So I thought, why not start the event series with probably the most controversial topic, meat consumption. And I'm really glad we've got such an awesome panel here today. I'll start introducing the panel to you. I've really got to stop moving so much. Alright, I'll start with Beck Lind. She owns and operates Big River Highland Beef out near New Norfolk, and was also awarded in 2017 the Tasmanian Rural Woman of the Year award, which enabled her to go to the USA and do some research into on-farm abattoirs. Beck has also recently become the CEO of Huon Valley Meat Co., which comprises of a abattoir in Craddock and a butcher shop in Hobart. Thanks so much, Beck, for coming today. Thanks so much. Next up, we've got Matthew Evans, slightly injured from a pig attack. You might tell us about that later. So Matthew's a chef by trade. Used to be a food critic over on the mainland in the Big Smoke. And moved to Tasmania and became a smallholder. He's the host of Gourmet Farmer on SBS. He's written over a dozen of books on food, and in 2019 released On Eating Meat. Thanks so much for joining us today. Yeah, great, thank you. And then last up we've got Paul Gilding, who is an independent writer and sustainability advisor. Paul was the CEO of Greenpeace, global CEO, has built and led numerous companies, and has advised lots of corporations and NGOs all over the world. Paul is also the author of the book The Great Disruption, about our climate crisis. And Paul is also one of the owners of the cannery and co-founder of Our Farm over in Downers Bay. Thanks, Paul, for joining us today. I'll start with Beck. Could you tell us a little bit about your story, how you got into farming cattle for beef, and then more recently becoming the CEO of Huon Valley Meat Co. as well?
Yeah, sure. I'm definitely an accidental beef farmer. I don't know if you had a look at my life plan 15 or 20 years ago, farming beef was definitely not on it. I fell in love with a piece of land while I lived in the Northern Territory. It was my first internet romance, I like to tell people. And I bought it almost sight unseen. And then moved back to Tasmania, which is where I was born and raised until I was about 15 in 2010. So I've been away for at least 15 years at that time. And I really just wanted room for my two horses. I needed to be 45 minutes from no more than 45 minutes to an hour from the city for my day job. I was a practicing paramedic at the time. And then I wanted an off-grid piece of land. And I only wanted about 100 acres maximum. So I ended up with 220 acres and 2 very fat horses and realised that I needed to find something else to run across the property. It's a very atypical property for running cattle, so I looked for an atypical beef breed and I ended up with the Scottish Highlands. So the Scottish Highlands were well suited to our landscape in that they don't mind being on the side of the hill, they don't mind it when it's really windy and really cold, and they could forage for themselves. They didn't just need a paddock full of mixed pasture grass that had been sown specifically for them. And working full time, I needed an animal that would assist me in looking after the landscape. There'd been bushfires and stuff through there, so it'd been a pretty essential thing for me to help keep the fuel load down. And so I ended up with 220 acres on the banks of steep slope overlooking the Derwent River up near Bushy Park, just right on the cusp of plenty of Bushy Park. Absolutely stunning, beautiful piece of land, and started off with 2 cattle, ended up with about 100, and since then we've progressively worked it back to about 45, which feels like a pretty good number for us to run. We are currently moving into a few other different avenues on the farm, so keep an eye on our Facebook and Instagram page and you might see a few different enterprises coming up soon. As Frank mentioned, in 2017 I applied for a bursary to travel overseas to look at small on-farm slaughtering practices, and that was born by having cattle that have got long horns, and we don't process them until they're at least 4 years old, so they're quite large at that point. Our local abattoir was really struggling to provide us that very high-end sort of product that we were after. We could get them processed, but they weren't packaged well enough. They were never processed on time. We had lots of problems keeping them secure at the local abattoir, all sorts of things. So we thought, well, what's the solution to this? At the time, we'd been refused entry to Paddock Hill Abattoir. No one else in the state would process animals with long horns. They deemed it all too dangerous. So my solution to that was, well, we'll build our own. If there's people like us out there as Big River Highland Beef, surely there's more people that need a niche sort of facility that will cater to people that are selling that premium product into some of, Australia's best food restaurants and places. So travelled away, spent 6 weeks looking at different, not all abattoirs, but different, because there are a lot of packing houses where you would have your animal processed in one facility and then it'd be transported to another facility where it would be broken down into portion cuts. And travelled around, did some really great research and had a look at some great places, and came back full of inspiration, thinking that we were going to build our own on-farm abattoir, and then our young daughter came along and that didn't happen. So that was, she's just turned 2.5, so in the meantime, Craddock Hill had closed down and reopened, and we'd struck up a relationship with Shane Briggs, and he'd started processing our cattle for us. He was doing a fabulous job, but they sort of fell into a bit of the typical small business trap of not really setting themselves up for success, all the right intentions, didn't really get all the business practices behind the scenes going, and just started sort of, I could see that they needed assistance, and I stepped in and offered to help, and on the back of that I was offered the role of CEO, and I've been there for nearly 2 years now, and so that's where I am now.
What would you say are some of the achievements, but also some of the future goals you've got regarding ethics and the sustainability of your businesses?
Definitely some of the achievements is not letting Craddock Hill Abattoir slide into the oblivion, which it was very close to doing when I came along. Without small facilities like that, the Tasmanian meat production, especially Southern Tasmanian meat production system, it has nowhere else to go. The most recent abattoirs to be built, there's one on King Island for 50 million, there's one in Geelong for 80 million. So if you think that it's going to cost that much just to build a reasonably standard abattoir, you can see that there's just not going to be more small abattoirs built in regional communities around Australia. Unless we can find a model that really works and that supports both what the community needs, what the producers need, and also what the staff and employees of facilities need. So definitely, you know, for me the future is bright. I think we've nutted out some things that have been really quite problematic in the abattoir industry, especially, you know, one of the things that I wanted to do when I took on the role as CEO is I wanted to join an organisation like this to try and make changes on the ground versus if I had got my own little off-grid bespoke abattoir out in the Derwent Valley, I would have been trying to make changes, but I'd still be an outlier. There'd be nothing changed in the industry. I'd just be providing something alongside the industry. Whereas now I think we're really sort of moving to a future where we're looked at to be, you know, a well-run operation, taking pride in our work, taking pride in our people, and yeah, I really think that's been a big challenge to turn it around, but I feel like we've recently just come around that corner. In terms of sustainability, we're moving towards as much as possible, and it has been quite a difficult thing to even map out, but we really want to reduce carbon emissions. We rely on a lot of trucks to do what we do. We're looking at little things like purchasing land around us so that we can ensure that we look after our own waste management, for example. We're currently paying to have that shipped away and dealt with by somebody else, but that doesn't feel good to us. We want to make sure that we're responsible for everything that happens on our site. I don't want to be outsourcing that sort of thing to anyone in the future. Sourcing or investigating our renewable energy options, and that's both my farm, my personal farm is already completely off-grid and has been since its inception, which we've always been very proud of. And doing that at the abattoir as well, investigating the different ways in which we can manage our waste, generate our own power. One of the plants that we visited in the United States was a massive plant that processed 2,500 head of beef a day in an 8-hour shift. Yeah, if you think about that for a second, literally just doing a tour through it, we had to put on your rugby shoes and take a duck and dive between the process lines that were going so fast. It was just, and that was only a medium-sized slaughterhouse in the States. They've got a legal limit. Nobody's allowed to process more than 6,000 head a day, just because they don't think it's good for the environment. 6,000 head a day. I can't even fathom that. Here in Tassie we do maybe 2,000, 3,000 head of beef a week. Not at Craddock Hill, we don't do that many. But the bigger processors would only do that, you know, maybe a week. Maybe when the season's really good and the export markets are open and domestic markets are really good and everything's working. At the moment, most big processors are only processing 3 days a week. So yeah, it's taking charge of what we do, being responsible citizens in what we do, just like you would expect in any other business. The abattoir industry should be no different. So really, sustainability-wise, I think, you know, give us another 12 months and it will be almost a carbon neutral operation, which we'll be quite proud of.
Would you say that government regulation is actually supporting you in what you're trying to do?
They're certainly not standing in the way of what we're trying to do. I think, you know, because we've got a well-regulated industry, it is regulated more to the export side of things. So we're pretty much left alone. As long as we don't do anything naughty, then we haven't had any sort of pushback. In fact, we've been quite well supported from the government because they see us as a strategic asset to the meat production industry, especially in southern Tasmania. We are the only small to medium-sized decent processor down here that could handle the volume that is required to be handled to service southern Tasmania.
Thanks, Beck. Matthew, I'm just quite curious, when you first moved to Tasmania and you started your farm, what was it that initially sparked your interest in farming pigs? Because you could have just set up a market garden, just growing fruits and vegetables, but you went down the path of farming pigs. Why was that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We actually, we've always had a garden, and pigs were an adjunct, I guess. We call ourselves Fat Pig Farm, so we have a little place 10 minutes away from here, Fat Pig Farm, where we grow food for our on-site restaurant. And we call it Fat Pig Farm because we used to go to the markets and we would sell pork products. And the reason we did that is we knew that we'd met someone who was growing really good tasting pork and was just selling it into the mass market, and they weren't getting any value out of it. More importantly for me, the customer wasn't getting great pork. Well, they were, but they didn't know why they would go to the butcher one day and get a good pork and go to a butcher another day and get pretty ordinary pork. Because the stuff they were selling was just going into the mass market and sort of lost. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if someone's valued that for what it is? Because it was free range, it was black pig, it was great tasting, it was fed a varied diet. So we set up a market stall at Salamanca trying to value that product. Then when then I had a little farm just at the side of Cygnet here, up Guys Road, and I bought a couple of pigs just for me to eat while we were buying in pork for the market. Fell in love with having livestock generally, but then having a garden, and managed to overgraze that piece of land and ruin that piece of land fairly quickly in a lot of ways, because we put too many animals on it too quickly and tried to do too many things too quickly, so we bought another piece of land. Now the reason why we love pigs now, and the reason why we got into them then, but the reason why we love them now is multifaceted. Pigs, from a chef's perspective, are brilliant because you can eat part of it on day one, so you can have the blood on the day it's killed and turn that into something. And then you can have the same pig. We're at the moment serving prosciutto that's 3 years old. So 3 years later, I'm still getting something of value out of this animal and the life of one animal, which is quite remarkable. And you can't really do that with lamb, and it's a bit hard to do with beef. And I'd say it's impossible to do with chicken, unless you've got a really good deep freeze. And so they work from a chef's perspective because they're so versatile, I guess. They work from a farming perspective because they have a short life, and that can sound pretty cruel when you're talking about the ethics of eating meat or sustainability. But from a farming perspective, what's sustainable is, can you do something that's financially viable? So if you think of cattle, Beck's cattle, they have a 9-month gestation. So the mother has to be at least 12 months old, probably older, when she gets pregnant. Then you've got 9 months pregnancy gestation. Then you've got 4 years. So you're up to nearly 6 years from the time the animal is born to the time the farmer can make any money out of it. Pigs' gestation is under 4 months, and their life is less than 6 generally for us. So in 10 months you can go from having no money to making money. And so from a farming perspective it works as well. But more importantly, I think from the sustainability point of view, is that pigs are the original recycler. So humans have kept pigs around us for lots of reasons. We kept pigs around us because we want to eat them, but because they recycle food. Okay, so they turn what we can't, don't, and won't eat into something we can eat. So on our farm, we have this massive vegetable garden, and I would guess that probably 3/4 of what grows in that garden is either unpalatable or undigestible to humans. But if I put that into a pig, it turns into human grade food. And so yes, we could compost it to put on our vegetables, and that's one way to be efficient, but there's another efficiency, which is recycling stuff. We milk cows, so I will milk a cow, I'll get 15 litres of milk, I'll scoop off a litre or two of cream. I don't need 15 litres of milk every day. I can only drink so much. Even if we make cheese, we can't consume the amount of milk that we produce. The skimmed milk, or the whey, if we do make cheese making, the whey is a nutritious product. We feed that to pigs, and again, it gets turned into human grade food. So that's why we do pigs.
So can you tell us what made you decide to write a whole book about eating meat? And as you were doing the research and you wrote the book, how did that change your perceptions of the meat industry?
So I wrote the book, came out a year and a half ago or so, and on the ethics of eating meat. And I was interested in it because I'm very conflicted about my own meat eating. We just dropped some pigs on the abattoir on the way here, and we left the abattoir, and my wife, who, she farms the same land that we do, grow the same animals, she said, I think I have to become vegan. Every time we go to the abattoir, she says, I think I have to become vegan. And we are conflicted about our own meat eating. And so what I was interested in is, why do I have this confliction? And I know that lots of other people have it. And also, livestock farmers are a bit of a punching bag for people when they want to find someone to blame for, whether it's global warming or whatever. And so I was and looking at our little farm and what we do, I was thinking, well, we make, not every decision we make is good, and not every animal we have has lived the ideal life, but neither is every human. But I was interested in those sort of conflicts of why some farmers are being demonised, and I was also interested in if we're growing food in a certain way on our little farm, and we're very open and honest about it, wouldn't it be interesting to see behind the doors of the most intensive places in Australia, and to bring that to light, because we're very, I'm willing to show people what we do and back it up, and if they don't want to eat meat, that's, we're all grown-ups, you make your own choice. I really don't care if people don't eat meat, but I want them to make valid choices based on useful information. And if we were willing to open up our farm, if the sort of the mass industry isn't willing to open up their farms, I wanted to know why that was and what they were doing and what they've got to hide. And yeah, there was a whole bunch of reasons.
And so as you were writing your book, what were the biggest surprises or learnings that you found?
The biggest surprise is something that still breaks my heart, and it was a thing that I discovered that the industry, the pork industry does, because we spend a lot of time with pigs. They're not always, putting a tusk into your calf. Most of the time they're really nice animals to be around. And when we deal with animals on our farm, we sort of think of death. We've come to terms with death, that death is inevitable, right? So there's more death in our vegetable garden than there is from the pigs and the cattle and all that kind of stuff. But no one cares about the animals that die in our vegetable garden. That doesn't seem to ever care about it. What was the question again?
The biggest surprises.
The biggest surprise was when I learned what can happen in some of our biggest pig farms, and they have it because what they do goes against everything that I think the community expects of them. And so I discovered this thing that happens in some pig farms. Is what they do. They have some diseases that are passed from the mother pig to the younger pigs, and when you have pigs in confinement, lots of pigs in a small space, disease gets passed around really easily. So it's a real problem for intensive farms to have disease in the sheds. So they came up with this system to prevent certain diseases being passed from the mother, which is what they call minimal disease pigs. So what they do, I met this guy he ran a feedlot in Queensland. He was telling me how he set this pig farm up. Some Japanese consortium wanted to set up a pig farm in Queensland. So he went to Japan to see how they ran their pig farm. And it was all in sheds, and they had to be so careful of the health of the pigs. They had to shower every time they went into each part of the pig farm, and then shower on the way out. So we had 16 showers in a day. So a shower when you go into the nursery, and a shower on your way out. A shower when you go into the weaning, where the weaners are, and a shower when you come out. A shower when you go into see where the boar is. A shower when you come in. 16 showers in a day. And then he told me this thing that they did when they set up the pig farm in Queensland. So they didn't want to get disease into the new piggery that they built. So what they did is they bought, I think, something like 60 sows, pregnant mothers, okay? These are sows that are just about to give birth. And on the day they were due to give birth, they anaesthetised them, cut all the pigs out, the piglets out, took the piglets and put them into sterilised wheelbarrows, I think his words, and wheeled them into the new piggery, and then killed the mother pigs. And so they killed the mother pigs on the day that they were due to give birth. And I thought, man, no wonder people become vegan. Like, no wonder people choose not to eat meat, because you can't. I don't think you can do that. Death is inevitable, but this kind of death, to take a newborn piglet away from the colostrum, the magic. Your colostrum is the first milk, right? For the first 24 hours, every mammal produces colostrum. It's this miracle stuff. And what happens with pig colostrum is 25% protein, right? It's massive amounts of protein. Most of that is antibodies, and it's the stuff that keeps the pig healthy, right? It gives them their immunity. They also get a lot of immunity and good bacteria from digging in dirt, but that's beside the point. But most of their immunity is gifted to them by their mother through a normal vaginal delivery and by drinking colostrum. We know that from humans, we know it from all mammals. And on the day that they're due to give birth, to keep them healthy, they kill the mother and give them a C-section and shove them into a sterile wheelbarrow and put them on some kind of formula in a shed. And they think that's farming, and they think that's appropriate. And I think that was the single worst thing that I heard of that existed. I didn't believe it was true, but then I looked it up, and the Queensland government website had a little thing on them at the time. They've changed it all now, but you could research it. And it was sitting there saying, "Oh, you could do this if you want. You can kill all the pigs." or snatch farrowing, so that at the moment they give birth, you can whisk them away to somewhere else. So like you, that lightens the mood.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Perfect time.
Please go again.
Right, I wasn't quite sure how to recover from that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Alright, cool. Let's talk about your farm. So you've also just recently set up a farm in Huon Valley. What made you decide to go down the path of animal farming, growing pigs and cattle? What was that?
I was actually talking to Matthew earlier about some real estate driven media article recently about Sydney being the new Byron. And Matthew was saying, yeah, it's different in a few ways. But one of which was really significant for us was this area makes you feel as though you should contribute. Right? You can go to Byron, lay on the beach, go to the pub, do nothing. Whereas you feel as though you're living here, you should be doing something in the community. It's a subtle kind of thing, but I feel it quite strongly. And therefore having land is also for me, and I'll come back to my kind of global work in a sec, but like the issue of if you own land to many, you should be producing food. Right? There's lots of debate about what sort of food's right and how you should do it and so on, but there is this, to me, a moral obligation that if you have land, you should be producing something with the land. There's a whole bunch of environmental and ethical and social arguments as to why you should do that as well. Like the land's better if it's used, in many ways when it's been farming land. But apart from that, there's just a sense where it's just right. And if people move to the countryside because it's got a nice and nourishing for your soul, etc., and then sit and look at the land, there's just something not quite right about that. So that was one of my big drivers. And then for Michelle and I think also back to the kind of ethical issues around meat as well. There was a sense where we're also conflicted at various times about meat and not meat and veganism and plant-based food, and very much in Matthew's camp about that's not a simple issue. It's not meat or not meat. There's massive environmental impacts of plant-based food, of industrial agriculture on crops and so on. And there's great meat produced, and there's, as we just heard, some great stories about horrific meat produced. So it's not a simple black and white issue. And so to me, the idea of meat, if you are going to eat meat, then you should recognise, first of all, that meat comes from animals, not from bullies. And that people, animals are dying for you to have meat. And therefore the life they lead is actually really important. Right? And people say, okay, if you eat meat, then how do you have these animals and kill them? My response is, well, how do you eat meat without knowing the animals? The ethical thing for me about meat is if you are going to eat meat, and there's very good ethical, spiritual arguments not to, but there's not many environmental arguments not to, but there are very good ethical arguments not to for other reasons. But if you're going to eat meat, then you should know where it comes from. Right? And you should and not everyone can grow their own meat, obviously. But if you are going to, then I think that's a really important part of it. That to me was important. And the second other thing is I'm pretty obsessed and have been for 30 years or so by climate change. And I really want to understand this issue, and I'd like to hear from you two about this as well. This issue of farming for the land. How do you enhance soil carbon through grazing? How do you actually benefit the land and the quality of soil through grazing and through animals? And so we're now moving into that, like doing baseline measurements of the land in terms of soil carbon. How do we improve that? Phil, who's our market gardener, who's here today, does that in the vegetable and market garden as well. Really important issue to understand, because there are ranging claims ranging from, with the right kind of agriculture, we can absorb all the emissions that humans produce, right, and make ourselves a net positive in terms of carbon globally through livestock. Through to those who argue that's complete bullshit and it lasts about 5 years and then negative. Right? And I just think it's a classic area where the science is early and it's got incredible potential. There's no question that, for example, the right sort of livestock grazing is good for the soil. The science on that is very clear. But is it actually good on a long-term basis for global climate relative to the emissions from methane emissions and so on? Unknown. And therefore, given I'm talking about this stuff, I really want to know how it works. Right? And so being hands-on in that process is also really important. And we do pigs, and pigs are just really cool.
Well, that's a good answer.
So we've had the no, but they keep away from.
But they are a bit dangerous. So what do you consider some of the challenges we're facing here in Tasmania regarding food production and meat consumption?
Yeah. So I think the big issue for us, we kill our own pigs in the farm to eat ourselves, but legally you can't use them here, for example. Right, so you have to go to credit. Thank goodness you can save credit. You and your friends, incredibly important for the community as a whole. But I think there is a really good argument about on-farm slaughter. Despite, if you do it the best possible way in an abattoir, there is nothing better for the pig than to be having its daily feed and then die. That sounds sort of harsh, but meat does come from animals and they die. And so to have your pigs come in, and being shot on the farm while they're eating with their brothers and sisters, who look up and go, oh, fell over, oh, okay, back to eating, oh, blood there, I might eat that too. So it's really, it brings you very close to the reality of how those things work, but for the pig, right, that idea of actually being killed on the farm where you've grown up for me is a really important issue, so I'm really fascinated by that. And as Matthew and I have discussed and Matthew's written about, complicated regulatory context, right, and Matthew Joel Selton's good at this, is this all the regulation and infrastructure of society in animal production is designed for the benefit of large operations, because most of it's been done for large operations, and because changing that is exposes them to lobbying against those who don't want to change that. And I think for Tasmania, we have a really significant opportunity for all agriculture to do it in a different way. And there are so many small farmers here, and so much opportunity, I think, to do it differently. And that to me, we talked about canning, the complications of canning your food. Here we are in Canterbury, right? And that, what can we do locally, I think, is a really important, challenging thing, because we can really build. I'm going to come to the later conversation about the global system and so on, but we can be an example of how to do things very differently, which may or may not be replicated or be replicable globally, but it's certainly a wonderful place to show how things could be done differently, right? And incredibly good for the economy, locally, and very good for our souls to be living in a place like that. I think that's a really important way to live like that. We need a government that does that, and the government that facilitates that process, encourages it rather than discouraging it.
And following on from that, what do you think needs to change in the local food system?
Definitely, I'd say, just on that point, I think that there's room for the regulations to be sort of tweaked a bit. There's room for a hybrid model where you can kill on farm but still have it processed in a food safe environment. I think that's the biggest area that has the most risk, is making sure that that food stays fit for human consumption throughout the chain. There's areas all around the world, the states are quite good at it. You can kill and field dress an animal, but it has to arrive at a food safe facility within a certain amount of time. And I don't think we've ever investigated that here in Tasmania. We've been very much, well, it has to be either a mobile slaughter system or the current system. There's never really been that investigation of whether or not we could do it in a hybrid way, which, when hopefully they sometime soon sign off on being able to process wild deer as a food commodity rather than just shoot them and leave them in the paddock because they're in plague proportions. It's exactly what we're going to be doing already anyway. We're going to be paying licensed people to go out and field, shoot and dress an animal, put it in a cool trailer and drive it to the nearest abattoir to be processed as human consumption food. So is there not room for us to also do that in the form of pigs and cattle and other animals?
Yeah, and they already do it with wallabies,
Yep.
and they're on the mainland. They do it with pigs.
Yep.
They do it with camels. I think they do it with donkeys. So it's not a. They know that you can do it, and it doesn't affect there's no public health issue. They just choose to not allow it because it's not in someone's interest.
But I think that argument has always just been around, well, let us do a mobile system versus a fixed system, rather than, well, is there a better way or a middle ground on this? And there are problems with the mobile systems. I looked into developing a mobile system, and everyone always says, oh, there's a mob on the mainland, it's called Proveneur. Yeah, so, and that does seem like a bit of a shining light until you delve into it a bit more and realise that actually you sell your animals to them. They come to your farm and they process them. You don't get to keep them. They go onto a big cool truck and they go off to the system, the same as if you were selling them to Woolies, but that truck arrives at your place. You have to have wastewater, you have to have another truck that comes along actually, and so there's 2 trucks, or sometimes 3, one that puts the bodies in it and one that puts all the waste in and takes it away, but you don't get those animals back. They go, you purchase, they're sold to Proveneur team, and that meat is sold as Proveneur meat. And that's how the model has to work, because it's damn expensive to run a mobile slaughterhouse. It's expensive to run a fixed one, I can tell you all about that, but to run a mobile one is probably 2 to 3 times the overheads that I currently have. So, lots of things need to change.
And what do you think, what needs to happen for your approach to be widely taken up? Is this something about, information? Does that need to just...
I think we need more young people in the industry. For me, the future of food is about the people. We've got animals, we've got this pristine, fantastic environment here in Tasmania. We need more young, driven people to be able to put their hand up and say that they want to work somewhere within the meat industry that isn't just the big industrial, commodity-driven export system. If you want a job in a factory, go and work at Greenham's. If you want a job where you're close to the farmers and you're close to the animals and you actually get to have pride in what you do, then seek out a small abattoir, buy the damn thing, resurrect it and run it right. But I really think that's what needs to change. We need to, in Tasmania, 40 years ago there were 40 or 50 small abattoirs, and now there's probably only 6 small abattoirs, and the others are 3 or 4 big ones, and that's it. So if you think of the localisation of food supply, southern Tasmania would be stuffed without credit in terms of there are people in the Huon Valley that still drive up north to go and get their animals processed. And then there's people that just do it on the farm and sell it to restaurants and stuff illegally, which personally, ethically, I don't have a problem with, but legally, that is just such a big concern, because as soon as one farmer gets caught doing that, guess what, everyone else gets the telescope put on them, and you can really sort of see that smallholders will then become scrutinised a lot more, which is, what doesn't need to happen. So, the future for me is, and the challenge is finding people. That same place that we went to that did 2,500 head a day, we got taken around by their CEO on a personal tour of the plant. It was fantastic. But the biggest thing that he said to us is that it's all about the people that you're working with in the plant. If you haven't got the right people, then it doesn't matter how good your systems and everything is, it doesn't matter. They were paying their staff more than the local teachers were being paid. So they turned the model around from, if you don't do well at school, then you might get a job at the abattoir. He's like, I don't want that to be the case. I want people to do well at school and then come and ask me for a job at the abattoir, and we've got exactly the same attitude down here. We don't want to just take people on because they need a job or we need workers. We want people to really want to come and work with us because we're a small, unique team. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge, is finding the right people that fit in the right team for us right now, and keeping that workforce engaged. Just on a side note, we started off with 4 casual employees when I took over the place. Now we've got 20 permanent part-time and full-time staff and about 4 casuals.
Matthew, what are some of your ideas regarding more sustainable land management and also the managing of livestock?
Oh, that's a small topic. I can only... Yeah, 5 minutes. Great. So sustainable is a word that gets bandied around, and it's really lots of big companies wanted to classify themselves as sustainable. There's lots of ways to measure sustainability, but the really easy one is, can you do what you're doing forever? And what we do on our patch of the Huon Valley would be, we couldn't manage it the same way that Paul has to manage his farm, or the Untax manage our mate's farm, or whatever piece of land you have in the Huon Valley. It has to all be tailored to that patch of land. So when we think of sustainability, we think of what nature gives us, and so on our farm, all that really matters is soil. So soil matters because this tiny little bit of the Earth's surface You know, like if you imagine an apple, right? If you cut an apple, cut it in half, right? Throw half away. Cut the half in half again, throw another half away. So you cut it in half again, throw another half away. You've got an eighth of the apple, right? The rest is ocean. It's too hot, too dry, too alpine, too swampy, whatever. Can't grow food on it. Cut the last eighth into 4 pieces, throw 3 of them away. You're left with 1/32 of the earth. That's what we grow food on. It's a tiny, tiny little bit. The skin of the apple, right? The skin of an apple is not very thick, is it? But it's 80,000 times thicker than the topsoil is on Earth, right? The skin of the apple is the thickness of the crust, you know, the solid rock. But the actual topsoil that does all of the world's growing is 1/80,000th of the thickness of the skin of the apple, right? We're talking, there is not much of the world that we can grow food on. And we have to look after the magic bit, the tiny little bit of topsoil that does all the world's growing. Now, how do we look after that? There's lots of different ways. One thing we do know, and Paul alluded to this, is that we need to grow a certain amount of food for a certain amount of people. There are lots of ways to do that. If we're looking after soil, we've got to think about carbon in soil. So carbon, what growing plants do in topsoil is this amazing thing. You know, I grew up knowing about photosynthesis, and I was so bored when I got Mr. Sudo or whoever it was in year 9 going, oh, photosynthesis, plants trap, carbon dioxide that we breathe out, so they turn it into oxygen, so we can breathe that in, and then we can breathe out carbon dioxide, the plants breathe that in, right? But no, that's like boring. That's actually not the most important thing plants do. Plants take energy of sunlight, right? All energy on Earth comes from the sun, right? Plants turn that. I lie in the sun, right? I get really thirsty and a melanoma, right? That's all I get, right? A plant sits in the sun, and through photosynthesis, it turns, carbon dioxide and water, it turns that into sugar. Plants create sugar out of thin air. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Simple chemistry. Everything else eats that sugar. Whether you're a microbe living in the soil, or a fungi, or a human, or some kind of terrapin, doesn't really matter. All of that energy on Earth has come from that initial action of a plant photosynthesizing. But it can only do that in healthy soil. And the more carbon we can store in soil, the better. Now, one thing we do know, and I've just written a book on soil, so I can bore you rigid for way more than 5 minutes on this. But one thing we do know is that everywhere in the world, Europe, America, Africa, Australia, I haven't read the science on Asia, but I'm sure it's the same. Everywhere in the world, if you grow grains, if you grow wheat, if you grow other crops, if you want to store carbon in soil, you have to stop growing grains and stop growing vegetables, and you have to turn it back into grasslands, right? Because you keep killing the plant that was sucking the carbon out of the air and creating sugar out of thin air. When a plant captures sugars, right? Some plants only use 20% of the sugars they collect in their structure. The other 80% goes into the soil, the microbes in the soil. Okay, it feeds to the things under the soil. Most plants aren't like that. It's between about 20 and 50% of the sugars they create are fed to the things under the soil, and that becomes the living matter and then the carbon within the soil. So if you keep taking areas of land and leaving them bare, and half of the world's agricultural land is left bare every single year, so we are trapping no carbon, we are creating no sugars out of thin air for half the agricultural land in the world. So what they say is stop growing your wheat, stop growing your soybeans, stop growing whatever else it is that you're growing, your parsnips, your sweets, and let it go to grass, because that will restore carbon in the soil, because grass stores, most of its energy goes underground, okay? And that's the simplest, best way. The problem with that is you and I can't digest grass because it's made of cellulose. Cellulose, a sugar, okay? 50% of the sugars in the world are cellulose, right? Probably a bit more. And you and I can't digest them, but a ruminant can. So a sheep, a goat, a camel, a cow can digest that, turn that indigestible sugar into something we can digest. They can turn it into meat and milk. So what I do on my patch of land, because I can grow grass on some areas and it's very hard to grow other things, is I can turn sunlight into human quality food, but I have to put it through an animal. But in other parts of the world, that may not be a very good use of sunlight and the living plant. In other parts of the world, it may be better to just eat the living plant. And not every patch of our farm is the same, and not every patch of anyone's piece of land is the same. So some areas of our land are only good for grass, and others might be good for something else. And so what I'm interested in is, can we improve the land that we farm, and can farmers generally improve the land that they grow food on, and still feed people?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about, thinking about the whole world. And I'm sorry, I'm going to use that word sustainable again. I know it's a tricky one, and Monsanto say it is sustainable, but do you believe that meat farming can be sustainable?
Yeah,
At a
undoubtedly.
global scale?
Yeah, because that tiny little bit of the earth that's good for growing food, there's an equivalent amount of grasslands, areas that are rubbish for growing soybeans, that are rubbish for growing wheat or rice, that just don't grow anything else. So large swathes of the earth are only suitable to grow grass. So if we don't use them to grow something, then we're not using things properly. The other thing is, if you want to grow barley, right, or something, then we're only, the plant's this big, we're only eating the tiny little fraction off the top. And so what happens to the rest? And what they typically do, with things like, oats and barley, they might spray with Roundup and glyphosate or something like that. And those stalks, they would burn those, and then that, start carbon and nitrogen that is stored in the stalk just gets blown into the atmosphere. If you put that through an animal, you can turn that again into more human-grade food. So there's lots of waste products that come from the brewing of beer or the making of apple cider or whatever that can be fed to an animal. So the best use of a certain piece of land and the best use of Earth's resources is often to put things through an animal to turn essentially what we would call waste products into human-grade food. The fact that we generally don't do it that way, the fact that we have intensive farms that grow grains specifically for them on land that could be used to grow human-grade plant food, and we use fossil fuels to plant them, fossil fuels to fertilise them, fossil fuels to harvest them, fossil fuels to truck them, to the animals that are then kept in sheds, that's not a very good use of the world's resources. So probably my answer is, I think animals should be part of animals always need to be part of a functioning ecosystem. They may be domesticated, but intensive animal agriculture has a very limited lifespan in my opinion.
Thank you. Paul, you work with a lot of international clients as you're working as a sustainability advisor. What are some of the trends you're seeing that are being developed to feed the world's population?
Yeah, I want to actually answer that by picking up on some of the points that Matthew made about photosynthesis, and that really is the answer to the question. Is that there's a couple of ways the world changes, and fundamentally everything we're talking about here is about big changes in the world. Right? So we have to change politics, we've got to change the consumer attitudes, we've got to change farming practices, that's change. And change occurs for two reasons historically. One is, because the world would be better if we change, which is in many ways the way the environmental issues have been run for the last 40 or 50 years. It'd just be nicer, wouldn't it? If it was more sustainable, if we had more forest, if we had, a better world, wouldn't that be nice for our kids? Which it would be, and it is true. Then we change because if we don't change, we're screwed. Right? This is if it's not sustainable, it stops. And it's really important to differentiate those two ideas, because when things aren't sustainable, they by definition stop. And what's currently unsustainable is the agricultural food system, not just animal-based, but animal and plant-based, is unsustainable. Therefore, it will stop. Now, the difference in this case is that we've got 7 coming to 9 billion people who want to eat. And they don't want to eat because it'd be nice to do, right? They kind of have to eat. We don't have to eat quite as much as we do, but that's another story. But generally speaking, we need a lot of food. So how do you marry those two things together? The answer is we are going to see massive change, right, in the food system globally in the next 10 to 20 years, or it's going to stop, right? And that's a really important idea, because then, as we've seen with COVID, when we have to change, we change really, really fast, right? And that's a very important context for my next set of comments. So we are on the cusp of, I think, a revolution in food and agriculture and production of food that's only comparable to the invention, so-called, of agriculture 10,000 years ago. It's about moving from sort of harnessing macroorganisms, cows, pigs, plants, right, to harvesting and nurturing and growing microorganisms, right, referring to fermentation and the ability to produce food in the way that Matthew just talked about, but in a much smaller scale, literally, but a much larger scale commercially and in terms of our food production system. And this stuff is like going to blow your mind, probably more than the idea of the pigs being slaughtered, which blew my mind. I was like, oh my god. And this is the idea that you can actually grow. Sorry, at risk of doing a book talk here, even though I haven't read the book yet, is that the idea that the way we think about food is natural. Rather, it's natural to have livestock, it's natural to grow wheat. There is nothing natural about our food system, right? It is nature harnessed and organised by humans with technology. Whether it's tractors, right, whether it's the plough, whatever it is, whether it's breeding, we have been modifying nature for a very long time. And almost all of our food comes from human modification of nature. So what we're moving into now is this idea that we're going to harness nature further. I'll give you some examples to explain this. But we are learning through technology to do this stuff a lot more efficiently. Now, fermentation, for example, beer, right, bread, right, this is not like a wacko science fiction technology. The difference is that now we understand how it works, right, through genomics, through CRISPR, through artificial intelligence, through our ability to analyse things, we can see how nature works and how food is produced, all that exciting stuff about photosynthesis, in a very different way. And that's really super important to what's coming, which is that we will produce food, I think, in a profoundly different way, by actually producing the part that we want. And that's a long story, but to give you some very concrete examples. So there is a technology developed originally by NASA, who are looking at how do I grow single-cell organisms in space. And they developed a whole bunch of technology in this area and then sold it on to the market to develop it. And there's one example in the Netherlands, which is a company called DSM that I work with, who worked out, not worked out, it's obvious, that fish oil, right, comes from algae, which is then eaten by little fish who are eaten by big fish, and the fish oil grows up and it comes from the algae. And they said, well, that seems like a really inefficient way to process it, right? Why can't we get the algae and make the fish oil, right, using fermentation? And they worked out how they can produce, omega-3s and 6s, etc., from algae directly in tanks, using natural processes of fermentation. So that sort of interesting. But then you think about what that means. It means is that 25 to 35% of all wild caught fish today, right, is used to make fish oil going into agriculture and aquaculture. Right, so you could take out 25 to 30% of the demand for wild caught fish by producing this exactly chemically the same product in tanks using fermentation. Right, and the same thing applies to palm oil. Right, as opposed to pulling down rainforests and producing palm oil, you can grow the palm oil chemically identical using fermentation, a purely natural process. So this stuff is really important to get because most of the food that we eat is not the very cool pork from a fat pig farm or the beef from Highland beef. Right? Most of the food that we collectively as a world eat is processed food made from ingredients by big companies sold in Woolies. Now we can all rail against that, that's how most food is actually consumed and produced. And those ingredients can be made in a very different way, which is going to disrupt agriculture in a very significant way. Now then it gets sort of wilder and wilder from that. The next one I want to use an example of is just go home and search Solar Foods. This is a Finnish company that's worked out how to take sunlight, right, back to Matthew's example, sunlight and water and no other inputs, air, sunlight and water, and produce protein. Right, and using the wonders of nature, i.e. photosynthesis, and growing food in vats, right, in a natural process with hydrogen, with nitrogen, taking it from the air, and they have 10% of the climate impacts of plant-based food, right, and 1% of the climate impacts of livestock-based food. Right, and they can produce protein, and this is not like a science fiction thing, they're in the market this year. Right, and producing a flour that's very high in protein directly made from sunlight. So the point of this is that there is now, what your question, I'm finally getting to, billions and billions and billions of dollars being spent, right, by entrepreneurs, by venture capitalists, some big bad companies, and some great entrepreneurial companies to do very different things in food. Right, so Beyond Meat, you know, which is a very small plant-based food company, is now worth $11 billion. Right, like a Tesla type story about food production. So what that means is we are going to grow that side of food production in a very different way, incredibly quickly. It's going to be very challenging for those of us in Tasmania who like to think about our food coming from the land, etc. It's going to be very challenging for lots of people to think about how our food is produced and what you're eating. It has kind of a bit of Solvent Green, for those of my age who remember that movie, right, about it. Right? But this is where we're going, right? And we are going to produce a lot of food that way, and that's incredibly good news for nature. Right? George Monbiot wrote an article about this in The Guardian saying this is the best news we've had for a very long time, is that we can take out 50% of agricultural land and put it back to nature. Right? To growing grass, to burn back to grasslands, etc. It's not about the end of agriculture, but it's recognising that most of the land that we use today is not used to grow really cool market garden vegetables, right, that we eat in Canada, and most of it is producing highly processed protein, you know, foods that are going into industrial food production, and that can be replicated in a very different way, which leaves room for the sort of stuff that we do and love, right, to have that niche, I think, in a very different way. So that's a long answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've just touched on that. The thing that I find really interesting is that for us here in Tasmania, it's that we've got different options. It's a very wealthy part of the world, and we've got lots of room, so we can do really cool things and develop closed loop systems. But then you look at the global scale, you look at the world, and you look at 7 billion people that need to be fed. So what do you think are our options and what can be applied to the world's population? Would you say it is really going down that path?
So I think one of the really interesting things in that area is that, I think about this in global food systems context, is that most food today is focused on calorie provision rather than nutrient provision. Right? So we think about calories, we don't think about nutrients. Now nutrients from these guys' farms, is a very different idea than getting it from mass-produced industrial food production. If you have a nutrient focus, then the sort of technologies I'm talking about, which are coming through, are actually focused on producing specifically what we need to eat. Right? But it also means, back to the example that Matthew talked about at the piece, is that you get value for nutrients. Right now we get value from calories. But if you care about the food that you eat, and that's social change, if you care about the food you eat, then the nutrient value goes up, therefore the producer value goes up. Because it suddenly matters who produced that food, not just how good does it taste, but is it actually good for you. And I think one of the consequences of COVID is going to be a lot more attention on personal health, right? And therefore a lot more attention on nutrients. And that I think is going to come together, I think, to mean a lot more value for farmers. The whole old saying, there's lots of money made in agriculture, just none of it by farmers. Is absolutely true, and I think that's we have to change that fundamentally, and that means we've got to pay more for our food. And if we're caring about where it comes from ethically, but also in terms of personal health, then you will pay more for your food. Meat, I think is not a crucial part, you don't need it, but it's a really important part of nutrient density and the provision of nutrients, but it should be a very small part of our diet. Right? It should be very high quality. It should be produced in a certain way, and if you're going to eat that, then it should be not quite a flavouring, but as it used to be, it's a component of your plate. It's not potatoes, is the vegetable, right? And that's 10%, and 90% is the meat. That'll be flipped on its head. So 90% is the vegetable, and 10% is the meat, because it is incredibly rich in terms of nutrients. But then you can do it globally, right? You can't eat like an American globally. It's just not physically possible, whatever you think of the models of that.
I think this is a really good point to where we should open up to questions from you guys. Jasper's got a microphone if anyone wants to ask these guys a question. Jasper will be with you.
Thank you. Great respect to the panel. your ethics, your principles, and your entrepreneurial marketing ability, but that's not representative of most farmers. I'm a sheep farmer, and I breed fat lambs, and that's as far as my skill goes, probably. My sheep leave my farm and go to a stockyard in the north of the state. They're probably handled by freight handlers, by yard handlers, by the butchers, and wherever they go. They're probably 3 days once they leave my property to where they make their demise. I think they're good lambs. They're organically grown. They have a lovely life whilst they're alive. But my interest is growing them, and I have no ability or skill or interest in the marketing of them. Where they load, they become the production line meat that you're talking about. I'd like to know where they go, but I don't have the skills, and most other farmers are really only interested in growing their stock and leaving the handling of it to others. So if there are ways to reduce the stress on the livestock, and even an avenue of, for me, knowing where my meat ends up, to know that I have faith and confidence that the animals are going to be well looked after, the meat is going to be the best it can be, all those sorts of things. More of that there is available and possible to me, the standard farmer who just wants to grow the stock and then say goodbye to it. I applaud and congratulate those who can take that responsibility from me, the farmer, and take it further.
I think I can speak to that a little bit. It is such an important link. I think personally that I can grow pretty good beef. I'm a terrible potato farmer. I don't need to do everything that I want to make me feel good about farming. I don't need to be in charge of every single aspect. I think we all need to respect that there are people out there, and there are communities, and there are businesses out there that are really good at what they do, and that we should be able to develop a relationship with them and entrust them with that next phase of what it is that we do really well. I know some great chefs that can cook beef fantastically, probably better than me. But, so I don't need to be responsible for everything. I really respect that you know what your skill set is. I think that's perfect. And we should talk sheep prices after this one. But just blowing our own trumpet a little bit here, this is what we've been really trying to step up over the last, or since I came on board with Huon Valley Meat, is that I want to find producers like yourself and take that component away, but still give you enough transparency that you know exactly where your meat's being sold. So if you walk into our butcher shop in the city, you'll see every cut that we've got and what animal that came from and what farm. So, and I buy sheep from different people every week, and every week that board will change and tell you where our sheep came from. Today we've got Dillon Estate Dorcas on the way up. So it's really important to make sure that we can provide those connections in the community so that people know that there is a better way, that if you don't want your sheep, to be honest, they might be killed in Tasmania. It's quite likely they're going to Victoria. In Tasmania at the moment we're importing 10,000 head of beef a month from interstate to be processed and stay here overnight, and then we'll have a Tasmanian beef stamp put on it the next day. So you'll notice that Cape Grim is no longer Cape Grim, Tasmania. It's just Cape Grim because they can't actually produce the beef that they sell in export here in Tasmania. Most of it's from Victoria and southern New South Wales now. And you can't actually buy Cape Grim beef grown in Tasmania because it all goes to high-end restaurants elsewhere. So, if you don't want to be a part of that, then we've collectively just got to develop a better way so that we can have farmers feeling good about what it is that they put their heart and soul into all the time. Because I was heartbroken, I can sympathise with Sadie when she drives away from the abattoir and says, I need to give up a vegetarian. Raising pigs and taking them to market is the hardest part of it. Like, having pigs is fantastic, even when they trash your shed and steal your food and rip your washing off the line. They're still fantastic animals. But that bit where you took them to the abattoir and they were looking at you going, why are you leaving me here? Cows don't care, they just get off the trailer, off they go. But pigs are the closest thing to people, I think, and it's a heartbreaking thing. So you've really got to respect the fact that it is actually hard to raise animals and then process them. And if you're working with a farmer who doesn't feel that little bit of a twang when they drop their own animals off at the abattoir or put them on the truck and go, you know, there goes my heart and soul for the last however long that we've been growing these things for, then, you know, you're probably not in farming for the right reasons. So, you know, we definitely want to be that conduit, that company that you can come to and say, look, I've got these fantastic organically grown sheep. I really want to know that the best possible outcome is going to be achieved here. And then, you know, we're looking to do everything from helping people not market their own, but provide a market for their own beef or sheep or pork. You know, you have your own branding that you literally pay somebody else to do. The boxes arrive at the abattoir, we process the animals and we ship it out, but it goes with your name on it. So, you know, that I think is a model that we really need to do to be able to support farmers like yourself.
I think one of the problems is the commodification of meat. Even since I moved here, you know, because as all the small butchers have vanished from around Australia, you've lost that connection to the farmer. When I first arrived here, you know, I saw half a hog at $35 written on a board at the bottom butcher, and I was, you know, that was sort of great. And you know, you find out where they come from because they've gone through the local abattoir. When I went to Deloraine, I asked, you know, where's the beef from? They go, oh, it's my butcher, you know, some guy in his 60s, you know, missing half of his little finger or whatever, says, oh, it's from my farm. Where's the sheep from? Oh, it's from his farm. Yeah, where are the pigs from? 4 k's from here, you know, like they knew everything. But as we lose our butchers, we lose that ability to sell local, and the stories and the, you know, the celebration of the fact that you've produced something amazing, which really would be really nice if it was eaten close to where it was raised.
And I think it's back to the issue of how this is all about change. It's all about large-scale social change and how that occurs. The reason I'm focusing on corporate and market work is because I think that's where a lot of the change comes from, right? It comes from the market demand of consumers, but also of investors and so on. And of course it comes through regulation and policy, right? The companies will do what they can get away with to an extent what the market lets them do, right? Therefore there's a role for policy to enforce change. And I think, you know, I still think smoking is this great example of all this, is that, you know, I'm 62, you know, it wasn't, when I was at Greenpeace, we were flying around the world and I would make sure I got a non-smoking seat in the plane. They're like, what the fuck? How do you have a non-smoking seat? Is that person smoke not going to go to you? Pre-COVID times and circulate. But it's like, that wasn't that long ago. Right? Now how did it change? It changed through community pressure. It changed through government policy and pricing, right? Through market signals. And now, if anyone's lit up a cigarette in here, you'd be shunned, you know, very quickly and then thrown out like anchor. So we can get a lot of change very quickly when we choose to change. But this is the point, you know, we get the market that we choose to have. Right? We are the customer, we are the ones. Yes, corporates do this thing and marketing encourages this behaviour and so on. But fundamentally, we can choose a different market. Now, if we value that stuff, right, then we'll get it. Right? If the butchers that know where the meat comes from, right, get better custom, then they will get the farmers to change. And back to Paul's point, is that, you know, farmers in Australia are amazingly adaptable and have been for a very long time. Right? It's like, if the market changes, the farmers will change. Right? And this idea that we put moral pressure on farmers should behave differently, the whipping boy of climate change, etc. If they can make more money, have a more effective farm by doing things a certain way, farmers will do so. And that's how the change has to occur. Right? Is that when the market changes, when the demand changes, which is us, right? That if we want to eat less meat and have a higher quality meat, it won't cost us any more money. We'll pay more and eat less of it, right? So pay for quality, right? And there is limits to how much they can apply to 7 billion people quickly, but over time those things will spread. And the final comment is just how fast that can happen. There's a great report from a London think tank called Rethink X, really worth looking at, about the disruptive nature of technology and energy, which is their specialty historically, but now looking at it in terms of agriculture and livestock. And their view of the fermentation process that I talked about is that and this has just happened in energy, by the way, in solar and wind and so on, taking out the coal industry, which is pretty much completed apart from the details of that unravelling, is that this the same thing they say is going to happen to agriculture and livestock. That this industrial scale livestock is going to die a natural death from the combination of people eating less meat, right, of technology producing protein differently for ingredients, right, and they say that, it's, I think it's a fairly optimistic view, but they say the cow population of the United States will drop by 50% by 2030, right, so within 10 years, the size of livestock farming in the US will be cut in half. Now that's a mind-bogglingly large pace of change, but I can tell you in my area of advising companies to get ready for renewable energy, right, that's exactly what has happened. Right, it is now cheaper to produce power with solar, wind and batteries than it is, so it's cheaper to build and operate a solar plant than it is to just operate a coal plant, right, in more than half of the world. That's a mind-boggling change, right, and it happened, and 5 years ago no one believed that was possible, now it's inevitable. Right, so that change can occur in markets that quickly, and I think farms will adapt. And to your point, Matthew, and then back to yours as well, is that if we can pay farmers for absorbing carbon, right, they'll grow trees, right, they'll let the livestock graze, but they'll have a lot lower numbers, and the grass will be a lot longer, and will absorb more if they're being paid to do so. So I think we should recognise that scale of change is absolutely possible. But you have to have the consumer expectation, you have to have the public pressure, like smoking, and you have to have the policy. Right? You have to have government mandating certain behaviours to encourage that behaviour to occur faster.
Hi there, Paul. Just building on the comments you're just making, and also thinking about your comments in relation to nutrition, market forces, and emerging technologies. How do you see all of those things coming together to, support those people who are already hungry in the world?
Yeah, no, because one of the pushbacks on the sort of agriculture that we're talking about today is, it's all very nice if you're a rich person in Tasmania, but it couldn't happen, across the world. We need Monsanto agriculture to feed the world. Right? That ignores a couple of things. First of all is, most food is produced today on small farms. Right? Not for us necessarily, but most people are fed from small farm agriculture, right? in those sort of countries. And that's a really important thing to recognise, is that small improvements in the technology of irrigation, of ploughs in Africa and Asia, would actually have a very significant increase in terms of feeding people. Now that's conveniently ignored by the Monsantos, so we need Roundup Ready, soybeans or whatever to feed the world. It's just not true. Right? Is that most food is produced in that way, and that way I think we can improve dramatically. The second thing is that these technologies that I'm talking about, and I'm not advocating for them, I'm just seeing them emerge. I have kind of issues with them personally, but those technologies are pretty exciting because they're about producing food locally, right, at a small scale, and available for everyone. In the same way, solar is a democratising technology. That if you're in a village in Africa and you can get light from a solar panel on your hut, that changes your life dramatically and can happen overnight, right? Whereas if you want to put in a grid and a large coal, nuclear, whatever power station, that takes billions of dollars going through corrupt governments, and probably won't happen anyway. And this same thing applies to this technology. The technology we're talking about now to produce food differently can be done at a very local scale, and according to this report I mentioned about Rethink, is going to be cheaper. Right? So protein will get cheaper, nutrients will get cheaper, in the same way your iPhone has got more expensive but more powerful. Is that is going to apply to food. Food becomes more accessible, and that, if that's right, is really exciting, because it is a democratisation of food production. Whereas now the sort of plants you talk about in America, they're producing, processing 6,000 a day, etc. That's centralised Western capitalist food production, right? Which is not very good for the animals, as we're hearing, or for people, and is also actually pretty expensive relative to the alternatives.
I think one of the things that's really briefly is that we already produce enough food for 11 billion people, and we just waste 40% of it, and we don't have the political will to get the food that people need to the people who need it most. So in a place like Australia, we have too many calories and too much protein, most of us, but still 10% I think of Australians were food insecure last year, if not more. But it's not the problem of production at the moment, it's the problem of distribution and has been for quite a long time. And those problems aren't going to go away unless we can democratise it and get it to the people who need it the most and have them control it.
Thank you. My name's Elaine. I've got a question for you, Paul, on this manufacturing fish oil. I think it's very well accepted that a vitamin C tablet or an iron tablet is not as good as eating an orange, because you're getting much more than vitamin C or capsicum or whatever. Or protein is you're getting more from eating beef than just protein. And also, I think one of the, different foods and proteins and carbohydrates, and they come in and out of fashion. But I think the latest thing about what is bad food is ultra-processed food. And Brazil sort of tried to really discourage it starting in 2014. And it's become like the food group at the peak of the pyramid, those food pyramids, is anything that's ultra-processed. Now, if you're making these, I can see, you said it would feed perhaps aquaculture farms, but are you thinking that will also feed people? It's not going to be as good as eating fish, is it?
I don't think so. So that's why I say I have issues with this. That's one of my issues with this, is that we're going to we're only just beginning to understand the complexity of food nutrients, and in particular, or soil, for example. We're just learning how that works. But I think there is a reality that most of the food that most people eat, right, is actually, a lot of it's processed, but also a lot of this food that we're talking about from meat, for example, it then goes into processed food. So even though, yes, if you go and buy some halal beef, go to eat at Matthew's restaurant, you are getting very nutrient-dense food. The reality is that most of the food we produce today goes into very highly processed food. And a good example is Impossible Burgers, right? This whole plant-based meat thing, which Matthew's written about. We kind of think, that's good because it's plant-based. It's super, super highly processed food. But it's not good for you. Now, it's arguably better environmentally in terms of climate impacts, just climate impacts, but we have to have a lot more sophisticated understanding, right, of the environmental impact of our food, but also the nutrients of our food. And having said that, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, though, is not about processed food. So it's chemically, like palm oil, for example, which is used in a lot of food and is bad because of the consequences for deforestation. Palm oil is actually a really good oil, right, for making a whole lot of things out of. Just have to ask a chef, but the quality, viscosity, etc. on top is very special. And you can produce that using fermentation, so it's chemically identical. Right, now we have to learn what that means, in terms of nutrients and so on. But a lot of this stuff is as good or better than. So one of the things about the fish oil, for example, is that the oceans are very heavily polluted. Right, so if you can produce food in this way, it might be actually healthier in some cases, right, because it's actually done purely as opposed to having all the chemicals that we live with every day in our lives in part of that process. But it's not a yes/no question. There are some cases when your concern is absolutely valid, which is that it's going to be not as good for us. Meat is a natural whole food. So
I haven't even mentioned taste.
Yeah, no, exactly.
For those of us that don't like the process of the killing, then you do start to look for the alternatives. But that's not to say I like the idea that there's the hybrid. We had a steer that we had to put down because the kids wouldn't let us slaughter him, so he ended up being put down. 10 years old, and we had the most amazing steaks came off him. It does it because he wasn't traumatised and he just ate and eating in paddock, as you say, just was shot and put down, and beautiful. Yeah.
I was just going to say the flavour doesn't come from that moment. However, it comes from how you raise the animal and the longevity that it had on the earth.
Okay, so longer is better or not?
Longer is much, much better. We're eating beef off a 13-year-old cow at the moment. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
I think that the commodity-driven farming process of grow it, get it off the farm so I can grow it again, it doesn't eat my grass twice, is problematic for flavour and nutrient density in product. I don't eat spring lamb. I'm sure your lambs are lovely, but I'd much prefer something that's at least 2 years old or older. I've eaten 10-year-old sheep. And you treat it right and you respect the animal for what it was and how long it lived on this earth, and you'll have an amazing product that you don't have to just grow something for 12 months. Most beef is 14 months old if you're lucky. A lot of it is much younger. So it's definitely about hooves on the ground and years on those hooves and how you've treated it.
Yeah.
That last 24 hours has no impact on the flavour, but it may well impact the tenderness if you don't do it right.
Okay, good. Oh, so the tenderness, okay, because the home butcher sort of said, as he held up one of these steaks that was just, he said that tenderness was due to the fact that it hadn't been stressed at all. Another story that someone told me was that they couldn't get their pigs in the horse float to go to the abattoir.
Common problem.
Yeah. Without feeding them a bottle of brandy. And apparently it was the best tasting pork that anyone had had that Christmas. So that might be
What you want is a sleepy drunk, not an angry drunk.
but when you sort of head away from that idea, especially when you've got people like George Monbiot saying that we've got 60 years worth of soil, and that's at the numbers we're at, and he's predicting 10 billion people within the next 30 years, I think it is, or less than that. Maybe it's only by 2030, I forget his number was. But so he was talking, so my question is to Paul, he was talking about so like you were saying about the photosynthesis, but he was talking about bacteria making protein from bacteria. How do you actually support? I support very much the idea of finding ways to ethically. It's great that they live ethically; they should die ethically as well. But also, how do you, if you've made the choice that you want to go with something like that, which doesn't particularly, it sounds awful, but corn, of course, is similar. How do you support those industries? Is there a way that you can buy shares? I don't know. You're talking that you would be able to do that on a local level, but how? How do we get started with something on a local level where you can support food that way?
Yeah, I think I'm always amazed at sorry, the question again was blank.
How do you get the
Yeah, luckily. So I'm always amazed how many, people in Tasmania, in the Huon Valley, right, don't actually, they love living here because of that, the local producers and so on, but then don't use it. Right? So people go to Matthew's restaurant, people buying Highland beef. It's actually really to start at that point, right, is to recognise that we have to make it socially unacceptable. Okay, I'll just talk loud on my way to COVID safe. So I think people supporting it here with their decisions, making that authentic. Right? It's a conversation about if you're here, you should be contributing in some way. Now, not everyone can run farms, etc. But actually being involved in directly buying things locally from local producers, which is less convenient than going to Woolies and Coles, right, is actually part of the process. And that's why you generate an economy. One of my other fascinations is local economies. Right? The reason this place was so important to the history of Cygnet is because it employed mostly women, 100 people in season. Right? It was the economic centre of the town for a very long time, and it was owned by local farmers. Right? So that idea that you can produce a local economy by your decisions is a really important thing, really important idea. So making sure that your friends who visit here go to these sort of places and support them. Right? Making sure that your friends normally think about going to a roadside stall, buying fruit and veggies that way. It seems like it's not a token thing. It's about keeping the money in the town, in the community, supporting the people who are doing it, because it's bloody hard to make a living, right, farming. Right? And so I think doing that probably is the most important thing. And then of course people will come here and live here because of that sort of community. Right? And making sure they also do that. And making it normal to behave in that way, I think that's the most important thing we need to do.
Does that answer your question, or you wanted to know more specifically about those new technologies?
Yeah.
How would we bring them here?
Technologies on the local level, maybe.
So I think, I'm not going to give investment advice over the microphone, but there's a lot of money going into it. So if it's an investment question, asking your appropriately qualified investment advisor how to play in that space.
But is there anything else?
Yes.
Someone told me something about Woodbridge seaweed, but that's all I can remember.
No. Yeah. But I do think that's back to the local economy thing. I think people getting involved in supporting ways to support locals. Starting up new businesses is actually a very practical thing that we could do. And one of the things we've talked about is how do you bring together the people in this area to think about how do we support those sort of people. There's plenty of semi-retired, self-funded super funds that could be investing in local economies and so on. That sort of stuff I think is really important. That's the reason Craddock was saved. Right? It's because of local people who then invested in it. So I think that stuff is super important.
Yeah, no worries. So how do we get, and this is probably a question for Matthew, being sort of a bit of a food advocate and speaking to a lot of people sort of all over the country about food, how do you I guess, get people who are sort of outside the socio-economic grouping of people who are here today, who are here and spending some time, spending money to come talk about the future of food? How do we get them to not only, well, I guess let's just start thinking about it. Because for a lot of people, it's not even something they have time and resources and money to think about. It's often said to me that caring about where your food comes from is a rich white person luxury. It's not, so how do we, I guess, what does a panel think about how do you start that discussion and that ball rolling outside of something, outside of this discrete sort of group?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one of the things that we often try to get our head around, because it is it tends to be quite affluent people in the space that I've occupied for a long time, and it's always bothered me. I think the way to address it is to talk about the function of food, which is to bind communities and humanity. And so when you spend money with someone who lives nearby, you're actually supporting the community that you live in. So if someone doesn't have enough money, they're going to break into your car, So if you can give them some meaning and some purpose and some money, someone in your community, by spending money locally, that's a good thing. And I think that's probably the way in, is to say, if you want your community to be better, if you want your lives to be better, this is somewhere where you have power every time you spend money. You may not have much money, but everybody spends money on food, and that you actually hold that little bit of power, no matter how little money you've got, to maybe make a little bit of a change within your local society or your community. But yeah, in terms of the big picture of that, I find that it's a really difficult one. And look, if you've got other things going on, if you don't feel safe at home and you don't have enough to eat, you don't have a job, you don't go, oh, is it a black free-range pig or a white free-range pig? Or you don't all you care about is, and most people, everyone's got something going on, everyone just wants to get dinner on the table on a Tuesday night, kids screaming, whatever, late home from work or don't have work. But but lots of people, rich and poor, do care about the society that they live in and the people around them, and the value of jobs, and care about the nutrition they're putting on the table for the people they love, regardless of income. So there is possibilities, but it's harder, I think, if people don't have much.
I've got a few ideas about that. You would have heard in the last 10 years or so in the health space, people talking about health literacy and understanding, you're given a pamphlet that goes along with your medication, and we know that most people don't understand what is on that pamphlet. We don't, it's a real thing. We talk to people about that. I come from health prior to this, by the way. Why don't we have that about food literacy? And why don't we have that as a nutritional and, I guess, a community discussion? We should be lobbying local councils that every local council has to have a community garden. I'm from the Derwent Valley, and I'll ring in from down here. But our community garden in the Derwent Valley feeds a lot of local families that can't afford to buy those fresh vegetables at Woolworths, and it's just one of those things. Every time I go there, I might take $5 worth of veggies, but I put $20 in the box so that I can support that community garden to keep doing the good work that they do. But to me, the answer to feeding communities is actually a community-based agricultural system where somebody next door, is good at growing potatoes, somebody else can grow the beef. But making that food accessible and at a price point where people don't have to choose between feeding their family a particular type of steak versus just getting the cheapest chip stuff that's on the shelf at the supermarket. Just making places like Woolworths and Coles, arch nemesis, that they have to actually provide Tasmanian-based product first. Because if it's coming from Tasmania, most product grown here in Tasmania is grass-fed based protein or similar, unless it's chicken, unless it's Robert's Island Wagyu, which is grain-fed, feedlotted, by the way, for all those people that love Wagyu. 90% of beef grown in America is feedlot beef. 90%. So that 50% reduction that you were talking about earlier, let's just hope that comes from feedlot beef and not from grass-range, free-range beef. So for me, getting good quality food to the people is really, really important. And the more we can support communities to get that food into local supermarkets that are the ones that somebody goes to. If I think of my local area, say Bridgewater, where there is no farmers market, there's no bus to the farmers market in Hobart on a Sunday. There is no real clear pathway to good food culture in those sort of suburban areas. So why aren't we doing something about it? We sit here in a place of privilege, so why can't we go and support getting good food into those areas at a good price? I know the American system and the UK system has a lot of subsidies in place, but perhaps we should look at that in terms of a welfare perspective where we actually subsidise what we can afford and push that out into the community in terms of good quality product and quality food for our people.
Just to add one thing to that, which is that while I support what you're both saying, and it's absolutely true that we have to think about community gardens and how we do that and feeding people and so on, there's also a fair degree of bullshit in this debate publicly, driven by the corporate sector who's arguing, we need to, the coal industry use this. The banning coal was going to deprive poor people in Africa of energy. It was complete rubbish, as if the head of BHP ever gave a flying fuck about the poor previously. Right? It was like, it's just not true. Right? And that's really also true for the food issue. Right? Is that yes, there are very real issues, right? And it's about education and literacy, and it's also about policy, right? And imposing certain things. Banning caged eggs. Right? And there are things you just have to do. You go and look at people's supermarket trolleys, right? The issue is they're not choosing between the best beef and the worst beef or whatever. They're just getting all the shit they can fit in the trolley as cheap as they possibly can. Right? And this is the idea that we don't spend enough on our food. Right? So even, we have this thing that food should be accessible. Right? And of course there are people in poverty in Australia as well. I recognise that, I'm not saying that's not true. But there is this pathological obsession with things being cheaper and cheaper being better. I had this presentation once to the Board of Wesfarmers, right? And the guy who ran Coles with me. And I said, why is it better if food is cheaper? And it was just like, I was from Mars. Of course it should. We have an obligation to make things cheap for people. Why? Because cheaper food makes it more accessible, so they're buying healthier food because it's cheaper? No. right? But cheaper is like cheaper is better. Cheaper is not always better, right? The fact that you can buy more shit is not better, right? It's like it's just not better if you make things cheaper all the time because it encourages a whole bunch of very bad behaviours on farm, right? Because they're being driven to that sort of behaviour by the price. So it's not necessarily good for society, right, to make food cheaper. And I think that is a very significant mental shift we have to make, and a very significant policy shift we have to make, to recognise that we are making choices, right, and how we structure that economy is actually very important to the choices that people make.
I just wanted to say it's such a good question. I struggled with that a lot back when I was still living in Sydney. I was working with the Youth Food Movement, which is part of the slow food movement, and we just constantly got back to the point where we went, what are we doing? We're just preaching to the converted. Like, we're, again, privileged people sitting in our, in a West community garden picking basil going, oh, we're changing the world here. And it just felt really a bit, it was a bit frustrating. And I keep wondering whether there are ways maybe to get to people early when their kids really get into the education system and just start that so early that it becomes a normal thing that kids understand where food comes from. And I just hope, I really want to see a lot of change in that area.
There is some great work going on there. You can't forget about the fantastic Stephanie Alexander Guardian program and the work that Mona is supporting here in Tasmania. It was really odd to me to hear that Tasmania has some food deserts. Like, that's just a crazy concept for me growing up here and just coming back here and realising actually there's people that just don't get access to good quality nutritious food at any price. They just go to their local closest big supermarket and get whatever they can get to put in their trolley. And there's such a disparity between where you go. If you go to Woolworths in Sandy Bay versus Woolworths in Hoonville, and you take note of what's in the aisles, you will see a massive difference in processed junk food that's available here in Huon Valley versus what's available in Sandy Bay. But if there was just that more pressure from the community to lean towards putting good quality product, it doesn't have to be more expensive, but a more nutritious product on the shelves versus, I think there's 4 aisles of shit food in the Huon Woolworths. I'm pretty sure that's how many I counted, it might be more, but it's really, really different when you go to different socio-economic areas, and it shouldn't be.
When did they put Woolies in Gilbert?
Last time you cut your hair.
I think we've got enough time for one more question maybe, and then we should wrap things up. If anyone has a really tough one.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, when I heard Beck about you only want people to come and work with you who feel passionate about the same sort of processes. I don't know a lot about the education system here, but I do wonder about the TAFE and UTAS and Department of Agriculture. How on board are they with these sorts of changes, and what sort of role is there for them and what's happening?
I found them to be really, really supportive. I think they were quite surprised when I came to them and said that I want you to train my staff. I'm happy to pay, and they came to me and said, actually, we don't need you to pay. There's so many supportive programs. This is the first time I think anyone at the Craddock Laboratory has been in receipt of training that will bring them out with a trade qualification in a couple of months' time when they've all finished. And then there's another 3 or 4 programs listed for us to participate in. We've actually had both TAFE and a couple of online and real people-based training organisations come and offer us training now that they know that we're an organisation that's willing to participate. There's so much money out there to fund people being trained in agriculture in general if you as an employer set up to make that a thing that will happen. So I set aside a couple of days a month where I'm paying employees and they go and sit in the training room and they just go over with some really experienced people the ins and outs of the industry and how things should be done versus how they have been done in the past. And it's really made a difference in both the culture and attitude and also in their work. everyone who uses our facility has probably noticed some more consistency applied lately. So there's definitely, I think if you're willing as an employer to go out and look for assistance, it's out there. You've just got to find the avenue in, and you've got to find what fits for your organisation. But you know, even on farm, I've been offered money to be able to train people up. I don't have any actual employees on my real farm. I actually did, I've never about 10. But there's certainly a lot of assistance out there if you're willing to go and look for it. And the Tasmanian government, you know, they know that it's a priority to grow our agriculture system. And it's definitely available, so never be shy to go out there and seek assistance. I think there's more than 12 different organisations here in the South that are able to point you towards whatever types of training and education you would like for your staff or yourself.
Thanks so much. I think it's time for some snacks. I'm getting hungry. I just wanted to thank the panel again for being here today. That was great, and thanks to you for coming. We had a lot of interest in this event, and a lot of people couldn't come today, they couldn't make it. A lot of interstate interest as well, so I'm hoping that the next Future of Food event is going to be available via Zoom as well. I'm currently planning, it sounds funny, future of food events, but still looking at different topics and different speakers, so I'd be very happy for you to approach me later and let me know what you would like to see discussed, and if you have any ideas, if you know someone who you would like to see up here, just keep continuing the conversation we started, and thanks.